Sir, how are you? It's Jeffrey again. Today we're going to be talking about instrument flight and flight by reference to flight instruments. It's kind of a broad topic, so I kind of narrowed it down to a more manageable piece for this assignment. But this could be talked about over several different lessons with our students. The units that I used to create this slideshow is the Airplane Flying Handbook, the Instrument Flying Handbook, the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, and the Instrument Rating Airplane Airman Certificate Standards, or the ACS. The learning goal, the main goal of this lesson is for the instrument student to be able to understand and become proficient with flight by reference to instruments. The success criteria, which you're going to be able to do after this presentation, is be able to smoothly control the airplane by reference to instruments, understand the concept of an instrument cross-check, and understand how to make adjustments to maintain pitch, airspeed, altitude, and heading control. So, for introduction, every student or every instrument student needs to be able to fly the aircraft accurately and safely by reference to flight instruments alone. The reason that we need to do this is because our brain cannot process the information in flight when we're flying in IMC when we have no vision to help us out, because our vision is obsolete. Because you can't see outside of the airplane, you have no reference to the ground. So it can't rely on its postural system, and it can't rely on the inner ear to make decisions about where we are in space, so we become spatially disoriented. In order to overcome that, we need to be able to rely on our instruments, be able to correctly cross-check these instruments and interpret them to see if we are in a desired flight attitude or flight condition for our current phase of flight. So pre-assessment, what are some things that I think you should be able to do as a private pilot coming into instrument training? And that is tell me why we can or why we must rely on instruments in IMC. We did a little bit of your training during private pilot, just in case you got lost in the cloud or something like that, on how to maintain control of the airplane so you can get out of that cloud. Well, today we're going to start discussing how to fly intentionally into a cloud and still maintain that control. So obviously, I just answered the question as to why we need to rely on our flight instruments, but today we're going to really learn how to do that. So, what instrument or what information do each of the flight instruments provide, right? So, you're going to learn what the tachometer provides, what the airspeed indicator provides, what the attitude indicator provides. These are all things you should have learned in private. And today we're really going to hone in on some of that as well. And then lastly is what happens to airspeed as the angle of attack is decreased. This seems like a super simple answer, but until you really start diving into it, it could actually have a little bit more of an in-depth answer, which is something we're going to talk about here. So, aircraft control and performance. Desired aircraft performance is achieved by controlling the angle of attack and thrust. This is what allows the aircraft to climb, descend, turn, or fly straight and level flight. So pitch plus power equals performance. So control is determined by the attitude indicator. Sorry for the typo. By the attitude indicator and the power indicators. So we look at the attitude indicator and the power indicators, and we determine whether or not we're in control. So that's the tachometer, and the manifold pressure is what the power indicators are. Performance, this is the actual performance, which is determined by the altimeter, airspeed indicator, vertical speed indicator, heading indicator, and turn coordinator. So this is what we're trying to make sure we have under control, is that we have the desired performance for a particular phase of flight. So what is an instrument cross-check? An instrument cross-check is the process of seeing and interpreting the performance instruments and determining what correction, if any, are needed. So if corrections are needed, adjust the attitude or power settings as necessary to obtain desired performance. So if the desired performance for us is flying straight and level at 100 knots, we need to adjust the power and adjust our pitch setting to make sure that we're flying straight and level and that we're flying at 100 knots. If we want to fly straight and level at, let's say, 80 knots, we would adjust our pitch setting and our power setting, and then we would just trim the aircraft as necessary for 80 knots level flight. So that's what we're saying when we do instrument cross-check and things like that, is we're trying to see what corrections are needed for which phase of flight. If we're trying to turn, we roll into a bank. we use our attitude indicator, our turn coordinator, and our horizontal situational indicator, and we go into a turn. If we're trying to do a climbing turn, then we need to add in our vertical speed indicator and altimeter. But even in a straight and level, or in a level turn, we still need to cross-check the altimeter and vertical speed indicators just to make sure we're not climbing or descending. So if we wanted to climb, we would have to add in some of that power. If we wanted to descend, we could take away some power. So these are all parts of the instrument cross-check and how we fly the airplane. So what is an instrument cross-check exactly? It's defined as the continuous logical observation of instruments for attitude and performance information. That's straight from the FAA. So the goal is to maintain the desired performance. So a pilot must continuously cross-check the performance instruments to ensure proper aircraft control, right? So I'm gonna talk to you guys just briefly right now about the method that I like to use for instrument cross-check, and that's I call it the hub and spoke method. I think people call it radials or whatever, but it's basically where the attitude indicator is the primary source or the hub of your cross-check. The spokes are each of the other indicators. So as you see in the picture here, you kind of start at the attitude indicator, go over to the airspeed indicator. All right, airspeed's good. Back to the attitude indicator, still looking good. Down to the coordinator, still looking good. Back to the attitude indicator. Down to the HSI, we still look good. Back to the attitude indicator. Over to the vertical speed indicator, we still look great. Back to the attitude indicator. Over to the altimeter, still look good. Back to the attitude indicator. And we just continue that cross-check until we have to change our desired control. So when we want to change our desired control, we simply change one of our performance indicators. So if we want to turn, we do a climbing turn, let's say, to make this more complicated. We roll into 15 degrees of bank, let's say. We look at our turn coordinator, verify that we're in a turn. Our HSI starts to turn. Then we add back pressure, so we pitch up back to the attitude indicator. Then we add power, so we start seeing that airspeed indicator start to decrease until we add that power in where it'll level off. And then we'll start to see our vertical speed indicator start to rise. Tell us how many feet per minute we're climbing. And then our altimeter would eventually agree and start to rise as well until we get to our desired heading and then pitch or an altitude. And then we would do the process over again to roll out of that turn and level off into straight and level flight. So pitch, as I said earlier, is controlled by the attitude indicator and is measured in degrees. So we can pitch up 2.5 degrees, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, so on and so forth, obviously, until we reach our critical angle of attack. But we could pitch up, and the attitude indicator is going to give us a reading on how far we are pitched up. Bank is controlled by the the attitude indicator and the turn coordinator and the HSI. So like I said earlier, if you wanted to bank, attitude indicator tells you how many degrees of bank. The turn coordinator agrees, says you're in a coordinated turn and what your quality and rate of turn is. And the horizontal situational indicator is going to turn and tell you what direction you're turning. Power is controlled by the airspeed indicator, right? So if we add in manifold pressure and increase our tachometer or add in just more RPMs in our Cessnas or whatever, and our airspeed indicator is going to tell us how much power we have. It's what gives us that power control. So instrument interpretation, this is kind of what we were just talking about. It begins by understanding each instrument's construction and operating principles. Being able to understand what information the instruments are providing is essential to being able to fly with reference to instruments and IMC. That's what we talked about earlier. If we can't interpret our instruments, then we're not going to be able to successfully and safely fly in instrument meteorological conditions. Like I said earlier, pitch is determined by the airspeed indicator, altimeter, vertical speed indicator, and airspeed indicator twice. It's obviously the most important. And bank is determined by the HSI, the turn coordinator, and the attitude indicator. When climbing, descending, and turning, or trying to fly straight and level, a pilot must continuously cross-check and correctly interpret the flight instruments. That's very important. I teach even my primary students, and they're just going for the private. Common error with this is the vertical speed indicator is not an automatic thing. When you pitch up, power up, the vertical speed indicator sometimes even shows a descent. It just depends. And then eventually it'll catch back up. So it's important to know that vertical speed indicator also just lags behind by a few seconds. And that's what instrument interpretation is all about, knowing what those instruments do and when they do it and how and why they do it. Some common errors, improper control applications. That's, if you're trying to fly straight and level and you're a really low power setting, you're not going to be able to do that correctly. Or if you're in a really high power setting and you're trying not to climb, so instead you're, focusing on the our attitude indicator and not, maybe pulling a little bit of power back. So these are improper control applications. Failure to apply proper corrections. Again, that's going to be failing to correctly interpret the instruments. Improper instrument interpretation, obviously. And then another one that we didn't mention, but we will now, is fixation, omission, and emphasis on errors during instrument cross-check. So it's important that we don't fixate on one particular instrument like the attitude indicator and neglect the other instruments as well. Or fixate on the airspeed indicator and not, check out the altimeter, things like that. So we have to make sure we're doing a good cross-check going between all the instruments and make sure we're flying safe and accurately. And the goal is, by the time you're done with this instrument course and the rest of your flying, that you're going to be able to pass the instrument check ride, and this is going to be what you're expected to do by reference to flight instruments, just based off the very basic things we did talked about today. We'll get into unusual attitudes and things like that at a later time, but today, this is what we wanted to focus on, and I think we accomplished our mission. Look forward to hearing your feedback, and I will talk to you soon.